this video, I'm going to be building an awesome 1440p gaming PC build inside of this Corsair's brand new 2500X. The first of two new cases released by Corsair. Could this be one of the best chassis to buy in 2024? Let's find out. Now, as you can see quite evidently from the hardware on the pile, this build is an all-white theme system that I'm hoping is going to look the business. The first thing we've got to do is look in a bit more detail at this, the Corsair 2500X. Now, first impressions are really good. This is obviously the white colorway design, and Corsair have gone to great lengths to make this thing actually white in design. That means that all the internal grommets and accents are also white rather than grey as we've seen on their cases in the past. And the micro ATX form factor of this case already feels super compact, something I really like. So many cases nowadays are just absolutely massive and oftentimes for the sake of being large, which is why it's particularly nice to see Corsair offer a more compact option. Now, of course, on this case, the front panel is glass. There is also a 2500D where this swaps out for mesh for better airflow. Around the rear of the case, you can see the back chamber where our power supply is going to go, support for full-size ATX units with plenty of clearance. And again, when I talk about the white accents, all the cables on this build are individually sleeved in white. Great to see. That's going to mean that any system you put together sticks within that colour scheme a lot more closely. You'll also find at the back here a radiator and fan mount, a side mount if you will. Most of the time you'll want to use this as intake to pull extra fresh air into the case. At the top of the chassis you'll find support for up to 360mm rads with another 360mm rad mounting spot at the bottom as well. Of course at the rear we've got support for 120mm fans for even more airflow, and then of course our 4 PCI lanes. Initial impressions are that the build quality feels really solid. I like the quite cubey design of this, and obviously no glass pillar here means you've got more of an infinite view. So many cases at the moment feel like a blatant copy of the Lee & Lee 011 series, and I have to say this doesn't, at least not from my first hands-on impressions. One thing that's also pretty favourable about this case is the GPU support. Obviously the case is quite long, meaning support for up to 400mm long graphics cards. Really great to see. Otherwise, there isn't too much more to report about this case at this stage. Pricing, this isn't cheap, I'm not gonna lie. You're looking at $160 for the 2500D. This one obviously comes with no fans either, so certainly not a budget end chassis. But let's build in it and we can evaluate the potential value for money proposition a little bit later. Now, talking of building in it, what am I gonna build in it? Well, I've actually spent a lot of time picking and curating some really nice parts for this build. Of course, we needed a micro ATX motherboard, and that is where this comes in. The GIGABYTE AORUS B650M Elite AX Ice. As far as white motherboards go, it doesn't get much better than this. You can even see that GIGABYTE have gone to the lengths of adding these white AMD CPU cooler brackets on as standard, with the heatsinks being silver and the PCB itself being a light or very light shade of grey at worst. The back of the motherboard is a little bit darker by colour design, and you can see the integrated AMD backplate here too. It doesn't just look the part though, it also performs well. We've got Wi-Fi 6E, plenty of USB ports, display outputs which we won't need in this build, high-speed USBs, and then of course a 2.5 gig Ethernet and an optical audio output. All the boxes I like to see ticked on a motherboard. Now you might be wondering why I've gone B650 for this build rather than the higher end X670 chipset. I mean, this is not a particularly cheap system, and the reason for that is actually the CPU. I've gone for the AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D, a chip that you can't really overclock anyway, and a chipset like B650 is going to work totally fine. Now just to clarify, you can overclock RAM and CPU on the B650 chipset, but you will never have quite as much leverage and headroom as you will on that higher end chipset where the power delivery is better. The 7800X3D though is a great chip, 8 cores, 16 threads, amazing clock speeds, and nearly 100 megabytes of level 3 cache. It's unbelievable. L3 cache, the biggest bottleneck in modern CPUs, and for the price, I've seen this thing at like $350 on Newegg. Latest price and availability, well as always, be linked down below. As far as RAM goes, I've gone for a white kit, no surprises there. Corsair Vengeance RGB DDR5. Now this kit is only 5600. I would recommend knocking up to a 6000 MHz megahertz kit and keeping that latency below 40. CL36 is ideal. Talking of fast speeds, I've gone for Corsair's MP600 GS for the SSD. They haven't sponsored this video. It just so happens that the GS is one of my favorite Gen 4 drives out there. That's because it doesn't break the bank, but still gives you really good read and write speeds. And you can find a full review of this drive at the link in the cards section now. While I'm here with the motherboard, I do just want to investigate how the CPU cooler is going to mount to the CPU. That's because it may impact on the order we install the motherboard into the case. Cooler-wise, I've stuck with the Corsair theme. Couple of reasons for that. That iCUE link stuff, which is what we use in here, where all the RGB digitally connects together in a sort of easy daisy chain-like system, is fantastic. And secondly, because I want to tie everything in with Corsair iCUE and create the best, most cohesive looking build I possibly can. Now, cooler-wise, this one is not cheap, I'm not going to lie. This build is not intended to be for those of you with a strict eye on budgets. Fans come pre-mounted and pre-installed. Love to see that. More and more coolers are doing that at the minute. Even Deepcool's new cooler with the screen is doing that. This one's got the LCD display as well, which is really, really nice. And all of the cables for the display run up through this tube into a centralized hub at the top, making our life a lot easier. We need to take a look at our mounting hardware, which you'll find handily labeled inside this AM4/AM5 bag. We've got 4 posts included inside of that box, with a pair of brackets for the water block that looks a little something like this. Now, what this is going to do is actually screw into the pre-installed backplate we installed earlier. So this is nice and easy to prep. Just remove the stock mounting hardware and those lovely white molded AMD brackets and replace these with the 4 posts we just removed from the cooler box. That's all we need to do for now. The rest of the process can wait until later. The next stage of proceedings is moving the motherboard into the case, at least now that we've done that basic bit of CPU cooler preparation. It's only really when you lay this thing down fully flat that you really understand how long this case is. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to add the motherboard in a little something like so. I think all the standoffs are in the right locations as it is. Yes, they certainly are. Once that's all aligned, I can go ahead and just secure it down. All the screws come included in the accessory box with the case, making this stage of the build super simple. The cooler is going to follow in a moment. Once the motherboard is in, the next step is the CPU cooler. Now the top panel just removes really easily like this. And because of course our radiator has the fans pre-installed already, all that we need to do is just drop the radiator into the back of the case. Now obviously I'll need to screw this in properly, so give me a moment and I'll get it better aligned and screw it into place with 6 screws to make sure it isn't going to go anywhere. I'm now going to remove the plastic bracket which is protecting the pre-applied thermal paste, and then take off the brackets which are installed by default for Intel-based systems. The AMD ones, which I talked about earlier, can now slot into place without too much trouble. The reason I left it to this stage is so that I didn't screw up the pre-applied thermal paste, something which is intrinsically making our life a lot easier. Then it's a simple case of getting the block on. The tubes on the right is a bit more clean and it isn't going to hide the screen. Once that's sitting on, 4 thumb screws, these are included. Just tighten them by hand to begin with and then finish off with a screwdriver to make sure they're nice and secure at the end. The beauty of having all the cables and all the fans pre-installed is that this is one of the easiest coolers you will ever install. With that all done and dusted, I can then flip the case, which is now quite heavy, over and we can see the whole thing starting to come together. Now, I have actually picked up an extra pack of 3 Corsair iCUE Link fans. So these not only look the part, but fit with all the other iCUE ecosystem. I'm going to go ahead and pop one at the back in an exhaust config, and then on the side here, pop another 2 just here in intake. It's up to you and we'll see how the GPU sits. You may actually determine that yes, you would like to have another few fans at the bottom. I think that's going to be overkill and might look a bit too busy. That's starting to come together. You might notice as well, I use these new screws. The Corsair included 4 fans. It basically stops you ruining the inside of the fan thread, which is really great to see. So far as ease of build goes, one of the most simple PCs I've ever put together. This is amazing. Next up on the list is the graphics card, I suppose. Talking of which, I've picked up the GIGABYTE AERO 4070 Super. Now, if you want even better performance at 1440p and a bit of 4K, jump up to the 4070 Ti Super. If you want top of the range gaming performance, the 4080 Super is as good as you'll get without spending stupid money on a 4090. Now, Nvidia's Super lineup obviously gives a bit of a boost over the non-Super cards, and it makes them their most competitive against AMD since the launch of all the Radeon 7000 series SKUs too. Now, I'm a massive fan of the GIGABYTE AERO design. I said this in a recent build we did inside the Height Y70 Touch. They're just absolutely stunning GPUs that get the white color scheme down to a T. This 4070 Super design is also not too large, making it a good proportional fit for a build like this one. Now, in terms of getting it actually installed, it looks like, yes, the top 2 PCI slots are the ones we need to take out. So you get these nice included mini thumb screws, which are again pretty cool. Lots of this case feels quite bespoke, which is nice to see. This case is obviously limited by its size, the 6,500. The bigger chassis is going to give you a lot lot more options when it comes to mounting of various components, particularly of liquid cooling parts. Get subscribed as we might have something on the way. Now, push the clip down on your PCI slot, slide the graphics card in. Remember to take off the black plastic first, of course. Basics, James. Basics, basics, basics. And then, is that going to slide in? Oh, it's quite tight. That's very tight, actually. The problem, if I can demonstrate it, is that the end of the PCI bracket has to be really kind of forced through. This area here, there's just not quite a big enough cutout. So I would say a bit more tolerance there is definitely needed for the future. Use the same screws we took the graphics card out with to screw the graphics card into place, and then admire your hard work, because this thing is starting to look absolutely amazing. All that then remains is the power supply, Corsair's RM850. Now, you want to pick up the newer 80 plus gold ATX3 standard of this power supply. This is the non-ATX3 version, so I'll be using a sleek inline extension adapter. I'll link the more up-to-date one below, virtually the same price, so it doesn't really make any difference as far as part selection goes. Now, you might notice that this power supply is black, and this build is not black. I've picked up some cable extensions from Easy DIY Fab, nothing new there. I'll link those down below too, which are going to finish things off really quite nicely. All the normal cables to be installed, motherboard, CPU, and of course our graphics card power connector, and then a 6-pin PCIe power connector for the iCUE Link goodies as well. Just a little bit of wiring to do to finish us off, and I've gone ahead and plugged up everything via iCUE Link. Now, if we look at the hub on the rear of the case, as you can see, this is actually quite simple. We've simply got our PCI power going in here, and a USB to our motherboard front panel. That's giving the data and power for the hub. And then off the hub, we've got 2 wires. One is powering up the radiator at the top and the fan at the rear, while the other is powering up these 2 fans at the front side area. That's going to provide data and power, and essentially allows you to digitally daisy chain the devices together. The only slight negative to note, and it is a fairly big one with this build, is this area up the top. Unfortunately, I've had to add this cable in to connect the fans up to the radiator. I might try and dig out a longer one and run the cable from the left-hand side of these fans around the rear, so it's more hidden. And of course, this hub area. While it's cool to have a consolidated hub for all the different bits to do with the cooler and plugging in other devices, the location is not particularly ideal when you're mounting it with the tubes at the front of the case, as you would do in the 2500D or X series of chassis. But there's only really one way to boot this thing up. Obviously, we've got a montage on the way, but first, let's give it a jump. There we go. Wait for it all to spin into action. As I say, couple of cables I still want to tidy away. Really not a fan of this. Everything's all sort of going. Corsair logo on the cooler. Fans are spinning, but no RGB yet. Is it going to boot up? Come on. Oh, yes! Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Still a bit of tweaking to do, so give me a few moments and I'll rejoin you after the montage. Through into performance, and it's safe to say that this is a build that not only looks great but provides some fantastic frame rates too. I've tested this system in a wide range of titles, so why don't we start with Call of Duty's Warzone to kick things off. At 1440p high settings with DLSS enabled and set to the quality preset, we achieved 173 FPS on average. The 90 and 99th percentile results showed fairly consistent frame rates too, perhaps a few more frame drops here than we would have ideally liked, but generally speaking, performance was very good. Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 3 was unsurprisingly very similar, slightly better with 190 FPS on average, and again those 90 and 90 percentile results were not only higher, but a bit more consistent this time around. Both the Call of Duties look fantastic on this system, and the 4070 Super really showing its prowess as a great 1440p GPU. It does so again even in our next title, Starfield, a game that's been widely regarded as being really quite hard to run, very poorly optimized, and perhaps not the most ideal title for most systems to deal with. 1440p high settings and the 4070 Super clocked in an impressive 94 FPS on average. Obviously more of an RPG game than a fast-paced first-person shooter, so you don't need to be breaking through that 100 FPS barrier. But 94, still nice to see. It's a bit like Hogwarts Legacy, the next game, 1440p high here, and again, you don't really need to be breaking through that 100 FPS mark, but it's certainly nice to do so. 138 FPS on average at 1440p with everything tuned up to high. But what if you want to tune the settings down a little bit? Jump down to 1080p competitive settings. Everything on low except the render distance, which we pushed to far. Here the build achieved 292 FPS on average. Wow, certainly actually useful when you think of the high refresh rate 300, 360Hz monitors that are out there nowadays. Move through into Apex Legends at 1440p high, and the build again did well. 229 FPS on average, pretty incredible really at 1440p, showing great performance across the board from not only this build, but of course the 4070 Super inside. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to drop a like rating, get subscribed, see more all from me. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.